Am I dressed all right then?
I think we want to keep this casual.
Yeah.
You know?
All right.
I mean, it's one thing to have you in your tux, and there are other shots we have you conducting and
Yeah.
in your tuxedo. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this will be nice and relaxed, like you know, comfortable at home. That's the feeling we want. Okay. What I'll do, Jester, is we'll start at Blues Creek, since that's where it started, and I'll just let you go. And if we get off somewhere, if I want you to concentrate on something, I'll just break in and have you repeat something. And this is I'm never going to be seen, and I'm never going to be heard.
Yeah.
But it's a conversation between you and me. You know, off camera here. Of course, you can, look for wherever you want, but mostly the attention's toward me. Other than that, I think we're ready.
Yes, that's all right. I'm ready. Oh, you want me to start into telling you?
Why don't you start at Blues Creek?
Oh,
where were you born?
I was born in Blues Creek, a little town in North Carolina, and some years ago I went down there, and I passed through or something, and it was someone told me that the spelling was Belews. Belews Creek, we would pronounce that, because I grew up in Pennsylvania, and then all my schooling above that high school was in Massachusetts. So we would call that Belews, Belews Creek. Yeah. But the people, white and black, in this town call it Blues Creek, Blues, and that's the way they pronounced it, Blues Creek, white and black. And nobody laughed or made any fun of you if you said, I'm from Blues Creek, North Carolina. And I was born there July the 9th, 1901. And my mother told me about my father being born there, right up in the woods there, and his full family, and that that family of blacks, formerly before two generations before me, were slaves of the white Hairstons. These were Scotch-Irish, the Hairstons, the white Hairstons, and they pronounced that Hosten, Peter Hosten, and all the Hostons. But the Hairstons, the blacks after slavery, pronounced it Hair, Hairston. So you have black Hairstons and white Hostons up there. But so many of the blacks call themselves Hostons. So you have both those names that you want. When I went to school in Pennsylvania, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I was a Hairston. And the boy with whom I went to North Carolina this past weekend came from Atlanta, Georgia. And even the Hairstons had some plantations down in Georgia, big plantation in Georgia. And I think one of the biggest was in Mississippi. I met some Hairstons. I've met white Hairstons from Mississippi, a lot of white Hairstons from Mississippi, and some from up in the one where I've just been, in Blues Creek, North Carolina. And we all, you may want to cut this, but I was right here in California one day, and my doorbell rang, and I went to the door, and this white fella, I guess he's about 30 years old or something, and I opened the door, and he just stood there, and he looked all around my house. And after a while, he walked by me and says, "I'm your cousin Woody, goddammit." And he sat down on the couch right there in front of me. I sat there and laughed. I was so tickled. He says, "I'm your cousin Woody, goddammit." And Woody stayed in our family there as long as he stayed around Los Angeles, I guess about 2 or 3 years. And he went over into the roughest black section of Los Angeles. Tough guys, sure enough tough. And Woody went over there and bought a pool room right in the middle of them and told them that he was my cousin. And I was on Amos and Andy show then. In those days, those blacks say, yeah, I'm his cousin. And he made a whole barrel full of money over there. Kept that food room about 4 or 5 years.
How did you get from Blues Creek, years-wise, what made you go from Blues Creek to Pennsylvania?
Pardon me. I guess my ancestors, my grandfather was born up there and was a slave up there. And then that's the last of the slavery, my grandfather. And then my father met my mother in a town that's near Blues Creek, North Carolina. I forget what it is, but they were over on the Virginia side. That's near the border on Blues Creek. And so my father must have met my mother over there, and then they went from Blues Creek up to Pennsylvania into the coke oven section where they were making coke for steel. You know, you fellas never saw coke, have you? No, you have seen coke? Yeah, well, they make that in Pennsylvania. That has to do with making steel. And my father died there in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, Connors, Connorsville, Pennsylvania. He worked in the steel mill where they made coke. You take coal, soft coal in Pennsylvania, and then heat it, and turn it into coke. Then that's used in the process of making steel, and that's what he did, my father. But he was a Hairston, but he was born right up there where I was born. And his folks, my grandparents, were slaves of Mr. Hairston, whose father was my host this past weekend down in North Carolina. I think so much of that relationship because this man, Peter Hairston, and I have been friends for 30, 35 years. We've been friends a long time. And I've been, he's been up here and other places where I lived, and we have very good relationship together with him and his brother. His brother's a teacher at North Carolina University, and he, for the past 40 years, has been one of the big judges in the state of North Carolina. So it's a big family, and my cousin Archie and I went down this past weekend and spent the whole weekend on his plantation where I slept in a big four-poster bed, must have been 5 feet up off the floor, and get into it with those big four-posters, you know. That I had done that way when I visited him before, and Archie slept in one. It was wonderful to be up in a bed like that, but you have to know how to get off. You'd fall down and break your neck trying to fall down on the floor. Getting out there, but it was a different life just for a day, 2 days I spent down there.
Let's pick up the point where you moved at what year up to Pennsylvania?
Pardon me, I think they moved from the little town next to Mount Airy, North Carolina. Yeah, Mount Airy, North Carolina, I think was where my mother said they moved from when they left from up in Blues Creek. And then they went to Homestead, Pennsylvania. No, they went up to this coke oven place below Pittsburgh, some little town they were, but it was a town where they made a lot of coke for the steel mills. And my father died there in 1902. Yes, he died in 1902. My sister was just a few days old, I understand, when he died. She was born in 1902. I was born in 1901. And then my mother and her whole family, her mother and brothers, all and sisters, all were up in this little town, and they moved on up to outside of Pittsburgh, a little town called Homestead, Homestead, nothing but steel mills. That's all it had, steel mills. And that's where I grew up, in that little town, Homestead. Finished grammar school and high school, all in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And my sister. And I didn't hear much, only just stories of my father's life in Blues Creek. That's all I heard until I actually went down there or got in touch with some of the people in Blues Creek. But I was told about his family where they lived and where so forth, in Blues Creek.
Tell us about your life there in Homestead. I know
Now, Homestead, I can tell. I grew up in Homestead. I stayed there from the time I was. No, let's see. Now, my sister was only 3 days old. I understand, when my father died in Pennsylvania, down there in whatever little town that was. Forget now. But anyway, she was only 3 days old, so that eliminated the connection that I would have had to the Hairston family. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, and her children, she had two boys and about 4 girls. They all moved up to near Pittsburgh, a little town called Homestead, Homestead, nothing but steel, only steel mills, on the Monongahela River. Monongahela was a very important river in those days. It is still a very important river. And there we settled down. And I was a year old then. And we stayed there until I finished high school. I finished high school in 1920. And so all of my pre-college days were spent in this little hilly town called Homestead, Pennsylvania. And it had very high hills up there. I sled ride in the wintertime straight down the hills, steep hills, all of Pennsylvania. That section of Pennsylvania was hilly, and we had many experiences riding up and down those hills. You know, a lot of the boys got hurt coming down the main street to run into the main street, which is at the bottom of these high hills in Pennsylvania, and with no. They used to put ashes on the street, a city block from the main street. You see, the hills all span right down, they're almost vertical. And then a block up here, they put ashes there to stop the sleds. And we go out at night, when I got big enough to do so, and put water on the ashes, and that turned to ice. So we come straight down, run into the cars. Some of them got killed, got hurt and everything. But that's children, we don't pay that any mind. A lot of boys got hurt running into the main street, because Main Street goes this way, and here come all these hills right down to the main street. And the car had those big, what did we call those things? A fender out in front of the streetcar. Was that a fender? I forget what it's called. We call it a fender, but it's out there to pick up stuff in front of the streetcar or something. And they had that. And some of the boys, I had a little sled we call a cheese cutter. It wasn't any higher than that. And you go down the hill on your stomach on the sled. And I remember an old bulldog named Sport. Good gracious, how many years is that going? Oh, my. And I'm going on 92. I remember that old dog, Sport, a big brindle bulldog. We used to tie, I had a little sled called a cheese cutter. It wasn't any higher than that. And you go down on your stomach. So I would get on my stomach and start down the hill. And old Sport finally learned how to jump on my back. And the two of us would go down the hill. And when we hit a block before the main street, the city put ashes there to try to stop the sleds of these boys. And so, when it was there, it was good. It would stop our sleds, you know, or we'd have to go at a slower rate. Then I had a rope on the sled, and I'd tie that rope to Sport. He was a big, strong boy, and he'd pull the sled back up the hill, and he and I get on. He'd get on my back, and down we go on that hill, up and down for years, up until I left. I graduated from high school in 1920. I was 19 years old, so Sport was there at home when I left.
Tell us about what your mother did and how your grandmother raised you.
My grandmother had to rear me because my mother worked for white people, and she had no special training. She couldn't be a nurse or anything. She had no schooling, and so she washed and ironed clothes. I used to hear her talking about the pay for that type of work, regular labor work. Now that's what it was, but she she washed clothes for wealthy white people or mid-wealthy white people, and her fee was $1.50 a day and car fare, 10 cents. Cost 10 cents to go to Pittsburgh from Homestead over and back, 5 cents over and 5 cents back on the streetcar, and that's what she got a day, and she gave her part into the family. They all stayed in as big a house as they could get, her brothers and sisters, 4 or 5 of them, I guess. And they all put the little monies together and rented a house. And that's the way we were brought up as kids. But right up until I finished high school, we stayed with that sort of an assortment of the kids. And I was a year older than my sister, so I was a year ahead of her in school. I graduated from high school in 1920. Pardon me, I was 19 years old that summer, and I had such a rough life. I started to work when I was 10. You're supposed to be, what was the child labor law? I believe it was 14 years old or something like that, 14 or 15. But I was only a little over 10. And I worked, and I can see them now in the brickyard. I worked in the brickyard down West Homestead, this little town, and we made bricks to build the furnaces in the steel works, steel mill. All steel mill furnaces were built out of silica bricks. They could stand the heat, the intense heat of the furnaces, and so I worked. Off-bear, I was called. We made bricks. You had a molder. Usually the molder was Hungarian or some Lithuanian, come from one of those countries, and he would just, everything was by hand. A big pan of clay would be dumped on the table, and then he would take a handful of that, and mold it into a brick size and put it into a mold, and another. And we had three molds, a mold with 3 sections to it, and he would fill that up, and we had a little bow with the wire was across it, and it pulled the top off excess clay, and then you have a brick in the mold with three bricks in your mold, and run up in the brickyard. And I stayed there from the time I think I was about 10 when I started in that brick. Yeah, going on 11, supposed to be 14. They had child labor law, was 14 years old in those days. I was 11, and I worked in the same thing, doing the same thing that the boys over 14 were doing in the daytime, but they made us, all the boys under 14 worked at night, doing the same kind of work. we had to 1,800 molds, 1,534 bricks, I think it was.
Do you want to sit forward for a minute?
Yeah.
We need to change our.
Yeah.
We want to pull this out just a little bit. Now, anytime that you want to stop to get a drink or anything,
yeah,
let me know.
All right.
Because we'll go on and on and on.
Yeah, that's all right.
But I want you to be comfortable.
I'll go another half hour or so.
I want to gather a few stories from that time, your relationship with your grandmother, and some of the stories that happened there in the house, particularly the raccoon.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you did, and I'll tell stories on that.
But anything about it's interesting to know that you worked in the brickyard and any other kind of thing like that. We just kind of want to see a little bit of the details of your growing up there in Homestead.
Yeah. Well.
Okay, we rolling again? Yeah. Okay.
Are you rolling again?
We're ready.
I don't know whether we were 10 or 12, but we were quite young, 4th or 5th grade or something like that. At 10 years old, I started to work, and going to school. First day of school. I'd like to mention something because that was so silly. My mother took me in this school, put me in this school up at 12th Avenue in 1st grade, and she couldn't write very well, and she had very little or no education. She told the teacher that my name was Jester. My nickname was Jestie, Jesty. That's all I was called, Jesty Hairston. And my sister and I called each other Jort. I called her Jort. She called me Jort. I named her. Her name is Anna, but I named her Jort. And so that was our names to each other. Her name was Anna, mine Jester, but Big Jort and Little Jort. She was always heavier than I was, younger and heavier. And so she was big. I was Big Jort, the little one, and she was Little Jort. So my mother went to the teacher that first day of school. I remember, never forget that. And she wrote my name down. Teacher wanted to know what my name was. And my mother wrote it, Jestie. That's what they call me, Jestie Hairston. And so she gave it to the teacher. And then the teacher took it. Miss Hill, I never asked for, goodness, that was in 1907. I was in the first grade. And Miss Hill was the teacher's name. So after a while, I don't know how long it was, she came to I don't know whether I was a comedian or what it helped in school. But one day as I was leaving school, Miss Hill had my name written down and gave it to me and said, tell your mother this is the way you spell your name, Jester. And I looked at it, and so I said, okay, thank you. I went home, told my mother, says the white lady said that this is the way you spell my name. And my mother looked at it and says, is that so? I said, yes, ma'am. Yes. She said, well, okay, we call you that, whatever that is. That's okay with me. So that's the way my name is, Jester. And I didn't know what a jester was until I was a second year in high school. And we began to show Shakespeare plays, And here a jester was a comedian. That's the first time I knew a jester was a comedian. And I found the jester talking about Shakespeare's comedians, and they called the jester, said so. And that's the first time I'd ever seen that name outside of my own name, Jester. And so every show that I've ever been in, I've been a comedian. that was 6 years old when this woman said that my name was Jester, and she wrote Jester. Now, I don't know whether I was born to be a jester or comedian or not, but all the shows that I've ever been in and had a speaking part were comedians. Now, Lord, I know on television for years and years, but every part I was put in mostly to be a comedian. That has interested me, that all the parts that I've had, people have just given me comedy parts to read. And I'd be starved to death now if I hadn't gotten those comedy parts. I wouldn't have had any parts.
Tell us about your grandmother, growing up with your grandmother.
My grandmother was a very devout Christian.
Let's start again. Ready?
My grandmother was a very devout Christian woman. She was Baptist. She was a slave, ex-slave. She was in the first generation of slaves we had with my grandmother, my mother's mother. My mother and her brothers and sisters were the first generation that were not slaves, you see, or the last generation of the free. And but my grandmother was brought up as a slave from a little child on. She was a slave, and she had to rear her two children, that is my sister and me, because we were the last ones of the cousins. My grandmother had 4 or 5 children, but they all married and left the house. And so my mother worked and washed clothes for people, kept house, and did whatever she could for $1.50 a day. And my grandmother reared my sister and me, and we were left the three of us. My grandmother, my sister, and me were left, and I, rather. But my mother worked and took care of it, and my grandmother reared us all the way up through school, and I don't think she died until Oh, I must have gone away to college when my grandmother died, yeah, after 1920. But my grandmother did the rearing and the whipping if I needed whipping or something like that. She gave me the whippings, and but she was a very devout woman and a fundamental Baptist. She was a real Baptist and a good Christian lady. My mother too, both of them. My mother. My father died when I was a year old. My sister was only 3 days old, so my mother couldn't even go to my father's funeral. And I've often wondered how sad she looked and how sad she must have been with only 3 days old baby in bed. She couldn't get out of the bed. Women in those days stayed in bed 14 days with children, and the midwife, they didn't have a regular hospital to go. You had to have a midwife, and so they had this midwife for my little sister coming along, and so my mother had a pretty rough time there, being in bed with this brand new baby, and her husband died, and they had to go. She couldn't go to the funeral because of my sister, and then after that, my grandmother, my mother had about three brothers, I think. Yeah, three brothers and three sisters. Yeah, three sisters. And they all tried to stay together as much as they could to help each other. But when we got over into Homestead, a little town outside of Pittsburgh, the aunts and uncles moved away and just kept my grandmother and to look after my sister and me. And my mother worked in the daytime, and that's what she did, $1.50 a day, all those days. I've often thought of her working, and all the clothes that we wore, that I wore rather, I was the fortunate one being a boy, were hand-me-downs from white boys that my mother worked for, whose parents my mother worked for, and they would give her clothes, and she would give me. I remember shoes and hats and everything that would be hand-me-downs from them. I had to wear all the time, but I looked for it, and that's the way it was.
Tell us the story about that you told earlier about the pet raccoon that you had.
Oh, I told Bob Hope that on a show that I was on with him when he was on that show there where he talked by himself. I was on a lot of times because he liked me, and one time I told him of my experience with Toots. My uncle caught Toots out in the woods. He was a great woodsman. He liked to be out there. And he found Toots. Toots was just a little baby, and he brought him home in his pocket. And he was very handy with his hands, so he made a nice, great, big house for Toots, and it slanted, with the roof slanted over, and little upstairs. He put a little ladder there so Toots could go up the ladder to his upstairs there, and had a big apartment up there. And we named him Toots. My sister and I named him Toots. And after he got so tamed, they had on a long side, rectangular here, on this long side he had chicken wire, and the other three sides were wood and a little slanted roof. He was very clever with his hands. It was a beautiful home that Toots had. And then this side was chicken wire. And we had a lot of little white friends that played with us. I never had any trouble attracting friends, boys and girls, white boy, and my sister too. And they would come from their home on the way. Only one block past our house was the school, Fifth Ward School, and so we were situated very close to the school, had to go only one block, and the kids would come from further out up the hill. They'd come down, these little white kids, and then someone told us that Toots had to have water a little pan of water. And so every time someone gave him some food, if it wasn't one of our friends or it wasn't us, he dipped the bread or anything in the food, in the water, and then eat it, you know. And so sometimes the little white children, 6 or 7 years old, in the first grade and second grade, I remember they used to ask us, why was this raccoon putting things in the water, a little piece of bread, or if a peanut, they shell a peanut and then put the kernel in the water. And we told him that white people were dirty that way, and that's the way he had to do, because to wash it, he wasn't so well pleased with the way white people had to eat. And they took that home. Oh, I don't know, but my mother brought it up. She did to us because it must have irritated some of the parents, white parents. And my mother told my sister and me, now you stop telling those kids that white people are dirty. We didn't know. We said he doesn't do that when we put. Yes, he does. He did the same thing when we did it. Only we didn't tell him. So that was the most stupid thing. When I told that thing on the radio, on Bob Hope's show, I had to come back next week to tell the same doggone story. Bob Hope suggested, you don't mean to tell me you told. I said most of their parents had good jobs. They had made a lot of money in the brickyard. You know, they were bosses of this and bosses of that. So we had to tell them something. We had a pride too. So we told them that white people were dirty, and the coon, even the raccoon, knew about it. And so that's what we did. But I know he had me come back a couple of times more to tell that doggone lie about truth. Then, when I grew up, I was in show business, and yes, I was in show business and married. I left home. My home people all back east, and I was here in Hollywood. And one night, my wife and long time after, because television came in, and we were listening to this man, this commentator, and he was talking. He had a story on raccoons, and he was telling about raccoons had no saliva glands, and that's the reason that they had to have if they eat anything that was just dry, I think it would choke them to death, and so that God made it so everything they went down their throat had to be moistened. And that's the reason. A lot of white people don't know that. So we consider ourselves very highly educated with Marsh. So when Marsh and I were married, we'd been married a year or so, and they were what is that now? A television show where they tell you about animals and different things. What is that thing? There's a lot of animals and sea trips and so forth. Geographic magazine or something like that. But anyway, it was a story like that, and that's where we got the information. And I was so surprised. Looked at Marge, and she talking about here a raccoon had to wash it because he didn't have any saliva glands. And Marsh said, you were telling white people all that. I thought they were dirty this way. So I know a lot of stories that white people think that blacks are dirty, just the opposite thing. And they don't, and they hear those stories from the time they were children on. But that was certainly a wrench to us. But that was one of the great things that we had. Toots was about 7 or 8 years old Toots was about 6 years old, I guess, when he got to be so big. And one Christmas time came, and Toots was a great big raccoon, and the mills were down, and my uncle weren't working, so we didn't have any money. And they were discussing what they could do for Christmas, and so finally they decided, well, we got to eat for Christmas, so Toots got to go. So we killed Toots. my uncle killed Toots and skinned him, and he roasted him at the dinner. I told Bob Hope that story too. At this Christmas dinner, we sat around at the table. I could sit over here at the end of the table. My sister was up here, and all my uncles and aunts were sitting around. My grandmother said the blessing, and then after the blessing, we started crying. Oh, Lord, I'll never see Toots again. He was such a grand friend of ours. May I have another piece, please? Bob said, Jester, you did. I said, sure, we were hungry. We had to eat Toots. Toots was the last thing. And you were asking for a piece. That's right. You have to ask for it. Your parents were older. And so we asked for it. Sit around there eating Toots. And we ate up Toots. And Toots was about 5 or 6 years old at that place. But we didn't have anything else. We came up that way. We had to eat what we could get. And Toots was just what we could get, all we had.
You were crying around the table?
Crying around the table. Everybody was sad, but my sister and I were crying. We said, poor Toots, we'll never see Toots. Do you remember when put this to the, come here, I have another piece, Mama. poor Toots, sure. We ate up Toots. Didn't mind eating him, but we were so sorry he was gone. You see, one of those kind of things. And we did that with a rabbit, too. His name was Tom, my uncle. We named him after my uncle. And he was a great big, what can you call those big rabbits? Jackrabbit. Yeah. He was the jackrabbit, Tom was. And we ate him, too. We had to eat Tom. And we asked for pieces for Tom because he supplied. If we had not had Tom to eat, we would have starved. We wouldn't have had anything to eat. But that's the way I came up. And I went to work. The child law was 14. You had to be 14 before you could work in any. I worked in the brickyards in Homestead. The brickyards are still there, but nobody's working in them. But I worked in there making these bricks to build furnaces we made the bricks, and then the steel mill bought the bricks from this brickyard and made furnaces to burn their steel in, But the bricks had to be able to withstand the intense heat, and they were silica bricks. That's what they were.
What about your high school? What did you do in high school? What were you interested in? I understand sports.
I was in high school. It's more.
Ready? Thanks. Sorry, Jester. That was my fault. Okay.
I was interested in sports in high school. Now I'm 14 years old now. Going to 15 years old, and I weighed 130 pounds, and went out for quarterback. I can see that now, and made it. Made quarterback on the high school football team my freshman year. And I had a lot of friends. I didn't run into the prejudice. Well, a lot of them called us niggers, and we fought that, and we called them honkies and dirty Irish and all that. I went through that whole scheme of things, and we had a lot of fist fights, but we were all friends. We never held malice against each other. Just fight for that day, and so. What was I talking about? These
football.
Football. Yeah, I went out for football, and they didn't have any prejudice in the high school. There were a lot of prejudices, but they didn't have the prejudice of not wanting blacks on the football team. But they did at Pittsburgh, at the University of Pittsburgh. I didn't know that. I didn't know they had that prejudice of not permitting blacks to play, and I found out that they wouldn't at Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, nor Penn State, nor University of Pittsburgh either. And so one of my teachers, I made quarterback on the football team, and was the lightest one on the football team. And I guess that the reason that I made so good is I could, many of the boys on the football team were fellas, great big husky boys from Estonia and Yugoslavia and Russia, those big, tall, big-chested, fellas. And they were all bigger, and I could think faster. and move faster because they were all much bigger than I. So I call signals and get the heck out of the road. That's all I did most of that. But I made football. I made quarterback on a football team. And one of my teachers, I am so proud of being a member of this country, regardless of the prejudice that is still here against my race of people. It may always be here. But I'm so proud to be a member of this country. I don't know any other country. But anyway, this white teacher came to a teacher of mine, came to the coach, and the coach told him that I couldn't play on football at University of Pittsburgh. And so he wrote up to Massachusetts, Amherst, Massachusetts, and asked them, told them he had this little black boy there, and he was very good in athletics, and also he had very good grades, and could they use him? And they said, so that's Massachusetts State University at Amherst. And they told him, yes, send me up there. So he told my teacher, pardon me, and when I graduated in 1920, I graduated in 1920, the summer of 1920. And they sent me up to, I went up to Massachusetts. And I didn't have worked that year in the brickyards, and didn't have enough even for my board, let alone for tuition and all that stuff. I had never heard of that, but just went up there anyhow because I heard they would permit blacks to play football, and I went up there and made quarterback, first quarterback on the first team they had at the freshman at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Massachusetts. With no thought of race. They just, I went out for it, and they made me quarterback. And I got pictures to show it, pictures that I can show me with this first team with quarterback in 1920. And we were in the class of 24. And I was tickled to death to get to be quarterback in there. But here's another white teacher in Homestead with all that prejudice. He's the one that wrote a letter up to Amherst whether I could come up there or not. So you have people and people. You don't have every white, all whites against all blacks or all blacks against all white. You have it pushed into you, and it's up to you to live the way you are taught and brought up to live. And that's what I've tried to do without hating anybody. But I sure don't hate the country. And it's going to be a new experience to a lot of us, but it's getting better every day to me. And it's always been that way. I met people at school. I didn't have any. I'm up there. I'm 18 years old now. Finished high school, and I'm up there. 1920. I was 19. Yes, I was 19 that summer, and I went on to school there with no money. I had the doggonest time, but I had a lot of nerve. I've always had nerve. Got there, and all I had was the money to go from Homestead, Pennsylvania, little town outside of Pittsburgh. From Homestead to Amherst, I went to, and I got off the train, and didn't have any place to stay even. And what did I do? I finally found a woman her name was Miss Goodwin at 1920. This was in the fall, September 1920, and I went there, and she was a black woman. She had 2 houses on the edge of the campus, beautiful campus, and still more beautiful now than ever. And she had two boarding houses, and she kept students, white students there. I was the only black that was in my class, and so she had these white students. She kept them there in her houses to boarding, and the ones who could pay their board, she too took their money, and so the few that couldn't pay, if they were good waiters, she let them be the waiters to wait on their fraternity brothers and something for their board, and that's the way she that's the way she ran her place, to let these white boys wait on each other for their board. And so when I went up there and went to her, here's my story on that. First day of registration. I remember that because I had $50 when I got off the train coming from Pittsburgh, 750 miles from Pittsburgh to Amherst, Massachusetts, something like that, And I went over to the college, and I made the rounds to registrate, for registration. And everywhere I went, they took so much money, so much. When I didn't have but 50, I didn't have $100 with me altogether to stay 9 months with, and they took over $50 the first day registration, for paying so much down on such and such a subject. And I got panicked. It went, oh yes, when I got down to $35, I began to panic, and I went to the office, the president's office, and wanted to go in, and they told me that the president was busy. And I said, no, I have to see him. He's only the president. And evidently I made so much noise out in the hall till the president was having a business meeting inside. And he heard some of this argument with crying, so forth. So he came outdoors, and he was a big, tall man. I'll never forget him. Looked like Abraham Lincoln, slow, but very, very nice and humble. And he says, what is it, young man? And I said, well, you folks are about to take all my money, and it's the first day of registration. I didn't know you were going to rob me on the first day. I didn't know anything about school. I thought they were going to rob me. He says, well, how much did you have when you came here? I said, I think I didn't have quite 100. I told him, and he says, how much have you got now? I said, I don't have but $30 now, something like that. And he says, yes, well, you're in trouble. Come on. He walked on. He took me in another office. Instead of the office that he was having a meeting in, took me in another office. And he says, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Homestead, Pennsylvania. And he says, oh, goodness, why'd you come from so far south? And that made me mad. I thought he was making fun of me. I said, I'm no Southerner. Yeah, I come from the north. And he says, well, you're a Southerner to us, 750 miles north of Pennsylvania. That's south. So I got a little quiet, and he says, well, you're in trouble. And so he called on the phone, and he was talking to somebody, and he said, we have a young man here with us, and he's the only one we have here at the college. He was telling her that I was the only black that they had at the college, and if you can do anything to kind of help him, he wants to stay here till June. But he hadn't got but $35. This is the first day of school in September. And so finally, she said she would take me. He said, if you can find a place for him and something for him to do, we appreciate so much, Miss Goodwin. And he took me over there. Someone took me over there, and I stayed with her that whole freshman year. She had 3 daughters, and that was in 1920. Her last daughter was Ruth Goodwin, who was my same age, and Ruth just died last week. I got a letter from another friend of mine, Ruth's age now, and she called me up and told me that Ruth had just died. The last of the whole family, all of them died. I've seen them all die out of the whole family. And this was the first day in 1920, and Ruth just died last week. I'm very sorry, but I had a lovely, lovely experience with that whole family. But I made the football team, and then I had to go back home after the first year, after 1921. And in 1921, I went back to Pittsburgh, and I didn't have enough money to go back in 22 and 23 and 24. It took me altogether 9 years to get out of college. I did two years. Pardon me. One more year there. I did my sophomore year about 3 years later. I did my sophomore year at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Then I had to work another 2 years until I got enough money to go back again. And I went to Tufts in Boston. And let me get jobs there. And I did everything I could to try to stay in school. And finally stayed in 2 years more and graduated in 29.
What were you studying at Amherst?
Music. Nothing but agriculture.
Okay, when you went to Massachusetts,
yeah.
why don't you start there? I was going to study
agriculture, and that's all they taught.
Would you repeat that statement again? Say,
when I went to University of Massachusetts, I went there studying agriculture because that's all they taught there. They had taught teaching and things like that, but the main thing was agriculture, and that was the state college, like Penn State and Massachusetts State, and every state had a state college taken care of by the state, and they all taught agriculture in those days, and I didn't know that, but until I way up. A sophomore at Mass Aggie, but that's what happened, and they let me stay there. So by the time I went to Tufts, 29, I graduated from Tufts in 29. I went 28 and 29 to Tufts College, but I had to stay out of school to work at the Tufts at the mill back in Homestead, go to school for one more semester and so forth. And finally, after 8 years or 9, I went in as a freshman in 1920, and I graduated from Tufts in 1929 as a senior. But I majored in my last 2 years in music at Tufts. People have helped me all my days in school. That's the reason I can't have any racial prejudice against people because people of all races have helped me. I met a little woman in Amherst while I was there in Amherst. I was a sophomore, went back as a sophomore, and she was as fine as she could be. Her brother was treasurer of Amherst College. Amherst College, I don't know whether you knew it, but one of the richest colleges in the Coolidges. Coolidge was president. He graduated from Amherst College, and that was a very rich college. Only rich people's sons went there to the boys' school. And this lady's brother at one time was treasurer of Amherst College. But she liked this black woman, Miss Goodwin, that I stayed with. They were good friends. People liked each other in those days. Miss Kidder liked Mrs. Goodwin together. So Miss Goodwin got me introduced to Miss Kidder, and then Miss Kidder took an interest in me when she found out that I was trying to work my way through digging potatoes and anything that I could to help me in school there. And then she started trying, every now and then she'd get up and give me $25 or something to do some work or something, help me. And her mother was an old time, she used to tell me about their ancestors came over right after the Mayflower, British ancestors. And I used to sit and listen to Mama Kidder, her mother, sat on the floor right here with my feet all out on the floor and sit there. She had a little rocking chair, and she sit and talk and read me the out of the genealogy of the Kidder family from Britain, and she'd read. So she read me about who was that man I was crazy about? Oh, Uncle Josh. She says, I loved Uncle Josh because he was, I guess, a man after my own character. And I'd ask her, I'd be sitting flat on the couch, and she was sitting in this little rocking chair. And sometimes she'd go to sleep, and then I'd wake her up. Grandma Kidder, tell me about Uncle Josh. And she says, yes, yes, he was your horse thief, Jester. And she turned the pages over and read me about Uncle Josh. Uncle Josh was the horse thief in England, you know. And I listened to this and all about Aunt Sue and Aunt this and Aunt that. I called him, I was right in the family. And Miss Cater helped me. Every year she helped me. And when I got married and moved, no, I wasn't out here. Was I out here? Yes, I was. I was out here on the coast. I came here to do a picture called The Green Pastures. Did you fellas ever hear of that picture? There's a picture, a black motion picture, and it was on Broadway. They did 2 years, that picture, that it played, or was a Broadway play. And then it became a movie, The Green Pastures. They wanted it for a movie. By that time, I was through. But I was assistant conductor of this choir that did the music for this picture on Broadway, and I came with the Hall Johnson Choir from Los Angeles here, and the last week in 1935, that goes back before you fellas were born, then. Yeah, in December of 1935, I came to California from New York. We were to stay out here 6 weeks, and I've been here ever since 1935.
You jumped a big span.
I
talking about Grandma Kidder.
Yeah.
So, I want just a little bit about that you wanted to be a landscape architect. Why? That you were going to school to be a landscape architect, and why?
Well, I was going to school because I wanted to be an architect because I had seen a lot of properties built up by architects, fine architects in Pittsburgh, a lot of lawns and so forth, beautiful. And they told me you had to have an architect's degree in order to get a chance to do that. And so that was the reason that I wanted to go, because I knew that you had to spend at least 4 years in school. And then when you came out, your job would be to lay out a landscape for different things too, like that. But I really didn't have any idea what an architect should do and how much you had to do to be it. And I came back after I came back my freshman year to Pittsburgh and started working in the steel mill. And then I met a teacher, Dr. Silverman, his name was. He was the head of the chemistry department at the University of Pittsburgh, and I told him I wanted to be an architect. And he says, well, come on over here, I'll help you. And he helped me, and I went back to Pittsburgh. But I knew then that they wouldn't permit blacks to play. But I said, well, I'll just go here and graduate as an architect and started to go to Pittsburgh. And did pretty good in my grades, but I found out that I didn't know what an architect really was supposed to do. And so I finally, after semester 2 at Pitt, I just quit and decided I'd wait until I got enough money to go. By the time I went to Tufts, I had gone into different music organizations, you know, and I began to like music more and more and more. And then they told me they had such a wonderful teacher of music at Tufts, Dr. Lewis.
Let's hold on for a second.
Mm-hmm.
They've started their chopping machine up there, so why don't we take a break?
All right.
For a minute.